Tredell has written 23 books and over 400 essays and articles on a range of literary and cultural topics stretching from Homer's Odyssey through Shakespeare and Dickens to Zadie Smith. He formerly taught literature, film, and cultural studies at Sussex University in the United Kingdom and is now a freelance writer and editor who gives lectures and seminars at a wide variety of venues. You can visit his website, his homepage, which we have put up in the poster, and you can see for yourself what fare Professor Tredell has to offer you. Thank you very much, Professor Tredell, for consenting to give us this wonderful talk today. Thank you very much. Over to you, sir.
Thank you very much. Thank you for that gracious invitation and for the introduction. I'm delighted by the miracle of modern technology to be here and be able to speak to you today about T.S. Eliot's The Wasteland. And there are several reasons that will, I hope, emerge in the course of my talk why The Wasteland remains particularly relevant to us at this stage of the 21st century. It was published 98 years ago in 1922, so it's almost its centenary, and it appeared at the time when the world was trying to recover from a global trauma, or rather two combined traumas. It was 4 years after the end of what is variously called the Great War, or the First World War, which lasted from 1914 to 1918 and claimed the lives of over 9 million soldiers. It was a war that began in Europe, but spread to encompass Russia, the USA, and the countries of what was then the British Empire, including India, which in fact supplied around 1.3 million soldiers, of whom more than 74,000 died in the conflict. Soon after the Great War came a second trauma, of a kind with which we're all too familiar in 2020, a global pandemic. In that case, the worldwide influenza pandemic that lasted in successive waves from February 1918 to April 1920, and that killed more people than the First World War, perhaps between 50 and 100 million. But it wasn't only the death toll that was traumatic. There had been murderous wars and epidemics in previous centuries. But this was compounded by a sense of epochal change, like the change in Europe from the Middle Ages to the Renaissance. There was a widespread feeling that an old world that had been established for centuries, since the Renaissance in fact, was breaking up, and that life and art would never be the same again. And indeed, it hasn't been. This was highly disturbing, but not wholly negative. There was also the feeling that this epochal change liberated energies, freed people from constricting patterns of behavior and constraining artistic practices. In the arts, this was evident in those changes that we have come to call modernism. Or today, we might prefer to say modernisms in the plural, to stress that there were many varieties of artistic modernism in many different parts of the world in this period. Modernist innovations appeared across the traditional arts, in poetry, fiction, painting, sculpture, music and dance, and the new medium of cinema, if not yet fully accepted as an art form, was an innovation in itself. For some of those familiar with traditional art forms, modernist innovations could be shocking, but to others, they could seem exciting. The initial reactions to The Wasteland, when it first appeared in 1922, illustrated this mixed response. Some more traditional readers of poetry found it incomprehensible and rejected and condemned it, just as people rejected and condemned the Cubist paintings of Picasso or the music of Stravinsky that pulverized traditional symphonic form. Others, particularly younger readers and artists, found it immensely exciting. The reasons for these different reactions, as far as The Wasteland is concerned, lie in the form of the poem itself. There are two lines in The Wasteland that, in a sense, sum up its technique, though they weren't designed to do so. Line 22 of the poem uses the phrase, "a heap of broken images," and line 430, which is the fourth line from the end of the poem, says, "These fragments I have shored against my ruins." And The Wasteland can indeed seem like a heap of broken images, or a collection of fragments. It's not a very long poem if you compare it to earlier English examples of long poems, such as Lord Byron's Childe Harold's Pilgrimage, or William Wordsworth's final version of the Prelude. The Wasteland consists of 433 lines in all, which isn't all that long, divided into 5 sections, but it covers an enormous amount of ground. It moves very quickly from one time and place to another, using a technique akin to what came to be called, in the new medium of cinema that was developing at this time, a jump cut, an abrupt transition from one scene to another that asks the audience to make the connections between the two scenes. This technique of jump cutting in The Wasteland also anticipates the way in which today, in the digital era, people might surf the internet on their laptops or iPads or mobile phones, moving almost instantly from one site to another, Googling terms that come to mind, or clicking on hypertextual links. Much of The Wasteland is set in 1920s London, but the poem also takes in Margate on the southern coast of England, Munich in Germany, unnamed but strongly evoked desert and mountain landscapes, the river Ganges, which the poem calls Ganga, and the Himalayas, which the poem calls Himavant. I'm using Eliot's own pronunciations here, and I'm aware that there may be different or perhaps better pronunciations of those terms. The Wasteland goes back in time to Elizabethan England and ancient Greece and ancient India. It is written mainly in English, but incorporates words, phrases, and sentences from German, French, Italian, Latin, and Sanskrit. And Eliot had studied Sanskrit at Harvard, not in huge detail, but assiduously, so that he had more than a smattering of the language. The Wasteland includes quotations from a wide range of sources, including the ancient anonymous Latin poem, Per Virgilium Veneris, the Christian Bible, the Upanishads, Dante's Inferno, Shakespeare's Tempest, and poems by Edmund Spenser, Andrew Marvell, Paul Verlaine, Gerard de Nerval, and the libretto of Richard Wagner's opera, Tristan and Isolde. That's only a short list, you could add many more. These quotations are not presented in quotation marks the usual way in an academic paper, for instance, in which an author indicates that he is using the words of another author. This was another element that shocked some of the poem's first readers. The poet seemed to be cheating, plagiarizing without acknowledgement, not inventing something new, not using his own words. Eliot, however, was unashamed about this, and indeed, in a preemptive way, he, as we might say today, doubled down on it in advance, declaring in a 1920 essay, "Immature poets imitate, mature poets steal, bad poets deface what they take, and good poets make it into something better, or at least something different." Now, Eliot, when he stole lines from Shakespeare or Spenser in The Wasteland, wouldn't have thought that he was making them into something better, but he would have seen that he was making them into something different by putting them in a different context. As he goes on to say in that same essay of 1920, the good poet welds his theft into a whole of feeling which is unique, utterly different from that from which it was torn. And he adds that the good poet's source will usually be the texts of, as he puts it, authors remote in time, or alien in language, or diverse in interest. and this is what he does in The Wasteland. As well as direct quotations, the poem also alludes indirectly but widely to Eastern and Western literature, philosophy, mysticism, and religion. Along with Sanskrit, Eliot had studied Indian religion and philosophy at Harvard, and it had fascinated him. He said, for example, of Indian philosophers that, quoting here, their subtleties make most of the great European philosophers look like schoolboys. The Wasteland also evokes a wide range of situations and characters, sometimes in a few lines, sometimes in a more extended way, as if you were quickly dipping into or surfing through a succession of novels and short stories, or perhaps as if you were listening to a radio and turning the tuning control so that you heard snatches of dialogue from a whole range of different places. It is through different voices the different characters in The Wasteland emerge. This raises a question, however, that was asked by some early critics of The Wasteland. If the poem has these sudden jump cuts, if it has this range of allusion and quotation, if it breaks at key points into foreign languages that not every reader may know, if it offers you glimpses of a lot of situations without following them through, if it is such a heap of broken images or fragments, isn't it too complicated, too abstruse, too obscure to speak directly to people? Eliot further complicated the problem by adding a series of notes at the end of The Wasteland that gives the sources and the apparent rationales for certain lines. It's by no means a complete series of annotations, and parts of it can seem misleading and sometimes satirical, as if Eliot were mocking an academic approach to poetry. Nonetheless, as those of you familiar with the poem will know, Eliot's notes have become almost a part of the poem. People reading, studying, or writing about the poem in a sustained way will be aware of and will often refer to those notes, as I will do from time to time in this lecture. But, it might be said, if you need notes to appreciate and understand a poem, and particularly if the author supplies them himself, isn't this a sign that the poem is not really successful? Surely it should be able to stand alone. We can answer this objection with another well-known quotation from Eliot, and he was quite good at creating, in his influential literary criticism, a justification for his practice as a poet in The Wasteland and elsewhere in his work. In his 1920 essay on Dante, he declared, "Genuine poetry can communicate before it is understood." In other words, we don't need fully to understand a poem in order for it to convey something significant to us, even if we cannot readily put it into words. If we think of encountering a poem in a language that we don't know, or with which we are only partly familiar, which most of us have done at one time or another, and especially if that poem is read aloud, we can often grasp something about it, because poetry works through sound, through rhythm, as well as through the kind of meaning we can paraphrase, put into words. The Wasteland is an erudite, learned poem, but it also communicates on the level of sound, of rhythm, of rhyme, of repetition, of variation. It goes back to the primal roots of poetry, in ritual, in song, in chant, in dance. And in this sense, its sound does support its overall meaning, because The Wasteland indicates that, in order to heal the global traumas of its time, and perhaps of our own, we may need to reconnect with these ancient roots that once seemed to bind society and individuals together. Some literary critics have tried to extract a coherent narrative from the fragments of The Wasteland, treating the poem as if it were a puzzle to be decoded that would eventually reveal an integrated pattern. Those attempts to find a coherent narrative can be very interesting, but they are not finally convincing. Critics have always come along with new interpretations. The sense that The Wasteland is an example of one of the most ancient forms of narrative, the quest narrative, is useful. But in the Wasteland, it isn't a quest that has a coherent protagonist, a clear itinerary, and a definite ending. It isn't, for example, a 20th century version of the quest for the Holy Grail, or a 20th century version of an ancient vegetation ceremony designed to ensure the renewal of the annual crops on which life depends. Although looking at it in those ways, and there are some very persuasive critical examples, can be fruitful to some extent. What I want to do here is to look at the poem in terms of two interrelated categories, trauma and healing. The Wasteland assembles a range of examples of trauma and offers not a cure or a complete recovery, but intimations, hints of healing possibilities. We'll focus on trauma first, and we should start with the poem's very first line. April is the cruelest month. In other words, we might say April is the most traumatic of months. This subverts a much more familiar formula in English poetry, in which April is not the cruelest, but perhaps the kindest month, because it is the beginning of spring, the season when life starts to reawaken after the long, chill quietude of winter. It's the time of the renewal, of hope. If we go back to the very dawn of English poetry, the prologue to Geoffrey Chaucer's Canterbury Tales, it opens with these lines, and we'll do it first in the original Chaucerian English, Middle English. When that April with his shores soota, the dropt of March hath passed to the rota, and bathed every vein in swish liquor, of which virtue engendered is the floor. Cast into modern English, this runs something like, when April, with its sweet showers, has pierced the drought of March to the root, and bathed every vein in such liquid, by which power the flower is created. But at the very start of the Wasteland, centuries later, April is the cruelest month. Why? The poem doesn't ignore the life-quickening qualities of spring as we see it if we follow it across the next three lines. April is the cruelest month, breeding lilacs out of the dead land, mixing memory and desire, stirring dull roots with spring rain. Those present participles, breeding, mixing, stirring, give a sense of active animate life in process. Lilacs are fragrant and visually beautiful, spring rain refreshing and life-giving. How can this be cruel? Because it awakens memory and desire, because it makes you remember a past that you may have lost and desire things in the future that you may not obtain. And this is painful and agonizing rebirth. In contrast, winter provided security. As the poem says, winter kept us warm, covering earth in forgetful snow, feeding a little life with dried tubers. What we have here is what we might now think of as a classic response to trauma. You try to limit the damage of whatever kind by shutting down all your vital systems, your consciousness and memory, your psychological and emotional pain receptors, and it is painful to awaken from that. Nonetheless, that awakening, while one continues to live, is necessary, perhaps inevitable. At first, however, in the Wasteland, it is, or seems to be, an awakening to nihilism, to despair. We shift quickly into a barren desert landscape, and a prophetic voice asks, what are the roots that clutch, what branches grow out of this stony rubbish? We are in a world where the sun beats, the dead tree gives no shelter, the cricket no relief, and the dry stone no sound of water. There is shadow under this red rock, which might seem to provide some refuge, but it turns out to be frightening and nihilistic. I will show you fear in a handful of dust. The imagery of drought, physical and spiritual, is important in the poem, as is the contrasting imagery of water from natural sources, rain, rivers, and the sea. In the section of the poem in part 1, in which Madame Sosostris, the famous clairvoyante, lays out the fortune-telling tarot cards, she finds a card of the drowned Phoenician sailor. Phoenician is the more usual pronunciation, but Eliot liked Phoenician, and warns, fear death by water. But there is also a suggestion, very important to this poem, that death by water, in the sense of a ritual cleansing and purgation, may be necessary for rebirth, for escape from the wasteland. Then comes, at the end of part one of the poem, the vision of post-World War I London as an unreal city, a phrase, an adjective that will recur in the poem. The speaker of the poem is going to work in the city of London with a crowd of other consumers and commuters. Unreal city, a crowd flowed over London Bridge, so many, I had not thought, death had undone so many. This is an adaptation and partial translation of lines from Dante's Inferno. So the speaker is seeing the crowd flowing to work as people living in hell, as being like dead people walking, animate spectres taken over by the automaticity of modern life. Perhaps they are also, in some cases, people who have returned alive from World War I, or who have lost lovers or relatives or friends in World War I, and who are haunted by the memories of all their comrades who have died. The second part of the Wasteland, the part called A Game of Chess, contrasts two other kinds of trauma. On the one hand, there is the fashionable upper-class lady in her boudoir, caught in a tense relationship, bored and discontented, rapping out her demands to her partner in staccato fashion. My nerves are bad tonight, yes, bad. Stay with me. Speak. Why do you never speak? Speak. What are you thinking of? What thinking? What? I never know what you are thinking. Think. The scene then shifts to a group of working-class women in a London public house, where one of them is telling her companions about her conversation with another woman called Lil, who doesn't seem to be present herself at that point. Albert, I should say, is Lil's husband. Here Eliot goes into the vernacular and conveys quite well a certain kind of London accent and way of speaking. But if Albert makes off, it won't be for lack of telling. You ought to be ashamed, I said, to look so antique. And now only 31. I can't help it, she said, pulling a long face. It's them pills I took to bring it off, she said. She's had 5 already and nearly died of young George. Chemist said it will be all right, but I've never been the same. You are a proper fool, I said. Well, if I won't leave you alone, there it is, I said. What you get married for if you don't want children? So Lil, we infer from this, is a poverty-stricken woman with 5 children who nearly died giving birth to her last child, who seems to have got rid of one baby by abortifacient tablets that have aged her prematurely, and who is apparently at the mercy of her husband's desire. So in part 2 of The Wasteland, the romantic and sexual relationships that might be expected to bring fulfillment and fruitfulness are traumatic, emotionally, and sometimes physically, painful and damaging. It should be said that Eliot has been criticised for the attitudes implied in this section, and elsewhere in the poem, charged with being too negative and for indulging a strong streak of misogyny. It is the women who are shown as neurotic and damaged and demanding, not the men, or at least when the men are shown as demanding, it seems to be accepted as an inevitable part of life. Well, if Albert won't you leave you alone, there it is, I said. Now these charges are true to a considerable extent. The Wasteland does offer a largely negative view of human existence, and women are sometimes portrayed as demanding and hysterical, like the upper-class lady in her boudoir, or sadistic and self-satisfied, like the one in the pub who is criticising Lil. That's not the whole story, however. In regard to its portrayal of women, we might observe today that the Wasteland is particularly aware of sexual violence against women and the sexual exploitation of women. A key motif in the poem is what it calls at one point, in part 2, the change of Philomel by the barbarous king so rudely forced. This refers, as you may well know, to an ancient Greek myth that exists, like most ancient myths, in several versions. But the one to which Eliot is referring tells us that King Tereus raped Philomel, who was his wife's sister, and then cut off her tongue to try to stop her from speaking about her violation and identifying her accuser. It's still a very powerful image of the silencing of sexually abused women. In the myth, Philomel is eventually changed into a bird, the nightingale, who sings, as the Wasteland puts it, with inviolable voice. This myth is the paradigm for several other key examples of such violence in the poem. In regard to the more general charge of negativity, the poem is indeed quite negative in many respects in its vision of human existence and human relationships, but it does also offer hints and intimations of other more fulfilling relationships and ways of living, ways of healing, to some extent at least, the traumas it depicts, even if those are no more than glimpses that seem difficult to realize in actuality. Part 3 of the Wasteland is called the Fire Sermon, and this is the sermon preached by the Buddha against lust, envy, anger, and other passions that consume human beings. But it is undoubtedly lust on which the poem focuses in this section, and on men's sexual exploitation of women. Again, it is set mainly in London. There are what the poem calls the loitering heirs of city directors, that is, wealthy, idle young men who possess young women on the banks of the River Thames at night, but then depart, as the poem puts it, leaving no addresses. So that if, for example, any of the young women became emotionally involved with the men and wanted to continue their relationship, or if any of the young women became pregnant, they would have no way of contacting their lovers and could not expect the fathers of their babies to offer any support. Then in this section there is the young man, Carbuncular, who thrusts himself upon the unresisting but indifferent typist in her bedsitter, who at the end of their banal carnal exchange thinks, well, now that's done and I'm glad it's over. There is also a young woman who is seduced in a canoe floating down the Thames. Toward the end of this section, the poem, so to speak, flows down the River Thames and out of London to the Thames estuary and to the seaside resort of Margate on the English south coast in Kent. And we have the lines, possibly spoken by the disillusioned young woman who has been seduced in the canoe. On Margate sands, I can connect nothing with nothing. The broken fingernails of dirty hands. My people, humble people who expect nothing. Then the poem mounts in intensity. Having invoked the Buddha's fire sermon in its title and earlier on, it now invokes a passage in the autobiography of the 1st century AD Christian Saint Augustine. The original passage reads, "To Carthage then I came, where a cauldron of unholy loves sang all about my ears." Eliot simply gives you "To Carthage then I came." The last lines of this section of the poem become incandescent, with an urgent run of present participles and a desperate, fragmented plea for rescue by divine agency. Burning, 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 burning. O Lord, thou pluckest me out. O Lord, thou pluckest. Burning. So the last line is that one word isolated on the page, burning. And we have moved away at this point from any coherent sentence structure. There's a breakdown of language, suggesting a psychological breakdown, not only of individuals, but of a whole society. The fourth part of the Wasteland, at 10 lines much shorter than the other sections, is called Death by Water. Remember Madame Sosostris's prophecy of death by water is something you need to fear earlier, and this in a sense extinguishes the fire that burns so intensely in the previous section. There is a possibility here to which we shall return of renewal and regeneration. But when we move into the fifth and final section of the poem, What the Thunder Said, we return to the desert landscape we encountered in the first section, but this time in a more mountainous region. So that we have, for example, these lines. Here is no water, but only rock, and no water on the sandy road. The desire for water becomes desperate and desolate. If there were water and no rock, if there were rock and also water, and water, a spring, a pool among the rock, if there were the sound of water only, not the cicada and dry grass singing, but the sound of water over a rock where the hermit thrush sings in the pine trees, drip, drop, drip, drop, 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 drop. But there is no water. This then extends into a more general vision of fleeing peoples and the successive destruction of civilizations represented by their crumbling capital cities. Who are those hooded hordes swarming over endless plains, stumbling in cracked earth, ringed by the flat horizon only? What is that city over the mountains, cracks and reforms and bursts in the violet air? Falling towers. Jerusalem, Athens, Alexandria, Vienna, London. Unreal. In this perspective, London, the unreal city that has been evoked in the first, second, and third sections of the Wasteland, is the latest in a line of cities doomed to decay. Eliot is writing when the British Empire is still very powerful, dominating a large portion of the globe, but after World War I, the cracks are starting to show, and the poem registers this. Later in the fifth section of the Wasteland, however, there is not a complete healing of these traumas, but tentative signs of it. And before looking at this, we can go back and trace some of the earlier intimations of healing in the poem, of ways out of trauma. We can start with the lines in part 1, The Burial of the Dead, that evoke the Hyacinth Girl. This seems to be a dialogue that gives a fleeting glimpse into a romantic relationship. You gave me hyacinths first a year ago. They called me the Hyacinth Girl. Yet when we came back late from the hyacinth garden, your arms full and your hair wet, I could not speak. My eyes failed. I was neither living nor dead, and I knew nothing. Looking into the heart of light, the silence. At first, this seems like a fragment of a lyric poem, the girl with her arms full of hyacinths and wet hair. This appears, however, to produce, at first, almost a kind of dumbness and blindness in the other participants in the exchange. I could not speak, and my eyes failed. That might sound negative, but it could also be seen as a prelude to a heightened state of consciousness. The speaker enters a zone in between life and death, where knowledge, or at least rational cognition, breaks down. I knew nothing. But this breakdown of cognition here results in what sounds rather like a mystical vision. The speaker finds himself looking into the heart of light, the silence. This is the kind of vision described in mystical texts that those who, for example, practice long and intense meditation can attain, although in this case it seems to have been produced by romantic love, which can of course sometimes produce exalted states akin to mystical ones. As we've already noted, nothing, used here in the phrase I knew nothing, is a recurrent key word in the Wasteland and can have very negative connotations. But here it is implied that knowing nothing, reaching a cognitive limit, reaching the frontier of reason can be the prelude to spiritual illumination. It is soon after this that, as we've mentioned earlier, the idea of death by water is first introduced, when the clairvoyante Madame Sosostris warns that it is to be feared. But, as we have also already suggested, death by water may also stand for a process of ritual cleansing, transformation, and regeneration. There are several references in The Wasteland to Shakespeare's play The Tempest, and The Tempest is a play set on a small, barely inhabited island in which some of the characters are believed to have been drowned in a shipwreck. But in fact, all of the characters who are apparently drowned turn out in the play to have survived, and everyone on the island, even the villains, undergoes some kind of transformation. It's summed up in the lines that the spirit, Ariel, sings to Ferdinand, who believes his father has drowned. "Full fathom 5 your father lies, of his bones are coral made, those are pearls that were his eyes. He hath suffered a sea change into something rich and strange." And Shakespeare's image of a sea change, which we still use in modern English to denote a very large-scale transformation, is very significant in The Wasteland, and it encompasses both trauma and healing. Trauma may open the way to transformation of a positive kind, ultimately, a change into something rich and strange. In the section in part 2 of The Wasteland that we looked at earlier, in the exchange between the upper-class lady in her boudoir and her silent interlocutor, who seems to answer only to himself, we have the following. "What is that noise? The wind under the door. What is that noise now? What is the wind doing? Nothing, again nothing. Do you know nothing? Do you see nothing? Do you remember nothing?" There you have an insistent emphasis on that key word in The Wasteland, nothing. No less than 5 times in 5 lines, with its nihilistic connotations of emptiness, of the void. But as we saw in the use of the word nothing in the dialogue with the Hyacinth girl, experiencing nothingness may also be a prelude to illumination. And in this section, do you remember nothing? Remember, those are pearls that were his eyes. And that, of course, is the quotation from The Tempest. It's an example of a transformation into something rich and strange. So there's a hint, even in the very fraught situations evoked in part 2 of The Wasteland, of a possible positive transformation. It's in the last part of the 5th and final section of The Wasteland, however, that the most positive possibilities are offered, and it's significant here that Eliot goes east. The poem cannot find, in the Western culture of his time, sufficient resources for hope and affirmation. Clearly, there's more than an element of Orientalist appropriation here, the Westerner turning to an idea of the East as the place from which to raid spiritual resources, as economic and cultural resources have been raided under imperialism. But there is also an acknowledgement that the East may offer elements that have been forgotten, obscured, repressed in Western culture. And in that sense, the movement of the poem is anti-imperialist, challenging the idea of Western superiority. What we have in the penultimate part of the last section of The Wasteland is a movement to the east, to India, to Sanskrit. I'm opening with the lines, and again I'm using Eliot's pronunciations here. Ganga, that is the sacred river Ganges. Ganga was sunken, and the limp leaves waited for rain, while the black clouds gathered distant over Himavant. There is a sense of tension, of expectancy. The jungle crouched, humped in silence. Then the thunder speaks, and it speaks in Sanskrit, in 3 words that the poem then glosses, interprets in English. Datta, Dayadvam, Dagyata. Eliot translates the first as give, and illustrates this with the example of blood shaking my heart, the awful daring of a moment's surrender, which an age of prudence can never retract. By this, and this only, have we existed. So the idea is that you give yourself, you cast off your ego to surrender to forces larger than yourself. A hazardous enterprise that may nonetheless generate an intensity that is unavailable in a more cautious, prudent existence. It's about taking risks. Eliot translated the second, Dayadva, as sympathize, though other translations render it as be compassionate. But Eliot links it with the idea of being imprisoned in oneself, in one's own ego. As he puts it, we think of the key, each in his prison. Thinking of the key, each confirms a prison. And a way to escape from it is, to some extent, by means of sympathy for others, or compassion for others, or perhaps a mixture of both. So both ways of translating it, and perhaps others too, can be appropriate. Eliot translates the third term, damyata, as control, which, if we think of it as applied to other people, is a questionable term nowadays. For example, we speak of a control freak to indicate a person who wants to dominate and coerce others. Alternative translations, however, render damyata as an injunction to strain yourself or control yourself, which would eliminate or reduce the element of controlling other people. It has to be said, however, that the example Eliot gives does seem to involve controlling another person, damyata. The boat responded gaily to the hand expert with sail and oar. The sea was calm, your heart would have responded gaily when invited, beating obedient to controlling hands. This could refer to some botched erotic opportunity, perhaps where the Hyacinth girl mentioned in the first section of the poem, as if he was saying, if I had been as skillful with her as I had been when steering a boat, she would have responded gladly. Controlling hands sounds a little creepy today, but it could also indicate an aspiration to a consensual relationship in which one person willingly yields to another. But we do here have an area of ambiguity, and it is best to acknowledge it as such, rather than trying to resolve it on one side or another. The last 11 lines of the Wasteland are a kind of microcosm, a demonstration in miniature of the technique of the poem as a whole. They mix together English, Italian, Latin, French, and finally, once again, Sanskrit. They include the refrain of a nursery rhyme for children and lines or fragmentary quotations from Dante, from an anonymous pre-Christian Latin poem, from the 19th century English poet Tennyson, and from the 19th century French poet Gérard de Nerval, and from the Upanishads. They start on a note of tentative hope and end with a temporary but deep peace. I sat up on the shore, fishing with the arid plain behind me. Shall I at least set my lands in order? London Bridge is falling down, falling down, falling down. Quassas cose nel foco teglia fina, quando fiamuti calidon. Oh, swallow, swallow, the prans dacite nella tua aboli. These fragments I have shored against my ruins. Why then I'll fit you, Hieronymo's mad again. Data, Diadvam, Davyata, Shanti, Shanti, Shanti. If you look at the opening lines of the section we've just read, I sat up on the shore fishing with the arid plain behind me. There is an implication that the speaker has crossed the wasteland, the arid plain is behind him, and that he has reached the shore of a sea that may offer the possibility, if no more than that, of a sea change into something rich and strange, of positive transformation. And there is some provisional action to be taken in the meantime. Fishing, which here may include the idea of delving into oneself and setting one's land, setting one's memories and one's mind in order. There is still the possibility of apocalyptic collapse, in the line from the nursery rhyme, London Bridge is falling down, falling down, falling down. This rhyme originated because in the 18th century, London Bridge, which had been the capital's only bridge across the River Thames until 1750, was literally falling down, top heavy with houses and shops that had been built on it, and with its structure crumbling. So in that sense, the nursery rhyme is a symbol of imminent destruction that the poem invokes in relation to early 20th century London, the latest in the succession of falling towers of great imperial cities cracking up and collapsing. And that's also, in this context, as we've suggested, a harbinger of the breakup of the British Empire. But the nursery rhyme from which Eliot quotes goes on to say that the bridge can be built up again, more solidly, with wood and clay, bricks and mortar, iron and steel, silver and gold, although each of these is ultimately perishable. Nonetheless, the possibility of building up again is adumbrated in the nursery rhyme. It's foreshadowed. The following line from Dante's Inferno means, then he dived back into that refining fire. So we have, as in earlier parts of the poem, the idea that fire, like water, may be destructive, but can also ultimately be purging, purifying, and renewing. In his original note to the last three lines, shanty, 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 Eliot said, repeated as here, a formal ending to an Upanishad. The peace which passeth understanding is a feeble translation of the content of this word. The peace that passeth understanding is a phrase from the Christian Bible, from St. Paul. But at this point, when the poem is first published, he is saying that Western Christianity has nothing equal to the profound meaning of shanti. Later in his career, after he had become an Anglo-Catholic Christian, Eliot altered the last part of the note so that it read, the peace which passeth understanding is our equivalent of this word, equivalent of shanti. That is, he later puts shanti and the peace which passeth understanding as equals that mean pretty much the same thing and carry the same force. But he didn't originally think that. In the trauma to which the Wasteland responds, Christianity could no longer supply the answer. In fact, the poem doesn't finally suggest that there is some big, complete answer. But neither is it wholly pessimistic. It painfully explores trauma, but it does offer tentative and often beautiful hopes of healing. Thank you very much.
Thank you very much. It was a very enlightening.
Thank you.
We are really grateful for you joining the call. Thank you so much.
Great pleasure. Thank you. Thank you for giving me the chance to talk at length about the Wasteland.
Would you like to take some questions?
Certainly. I'd be very happy to take questions and discuss any elements of it further.
Thank you so much. I would request the audience, the participants, to put forth their questions. Okay, someone has a very interesting question here. This is Adhyakar.
Yes.
He writes, has T.S. Eliot ever, the questions are in the chat box.
Yeah.
Ever faced serious charges of plagiarism in his life regarding the Wasteland?
No, I don't think he has, because he carefully chooses writers who are usually from the past, so that their texts are not protected by copyright in the modern sense. As he says, poets will borrow from remote or alien kinds of areas. So if you're quoting Shakespeare, for example, there's no copyright on Shakespeare's lines. if you're quoting Marvel, a 17th century poet, for instance, there's no copyright on his lines. I think if he had quoted from contemporary poets, that is, poets of the early to mid 20th century, then he would, of course, have been liable to such charges. But he's careful to go to the remote past. And in a way, he wants to do that poetically because he wants to summon the enormous power and charge of, say, Shakespeare's lines or Spenser's lines or Marvel's lines. So as far as I know, this never came up in terms of actual legal action against him. But nonetheless, there was that feeling people had that this was cheating. You shouldn't really be doing this. You shouldn't really be using other people's words. And if you do, you should put them in quotation marks. It's as I say, it should do in an academic paper to indicate that they are not your own words. And this did outrage people. Yes, it was something for which he was criticized at the time.
Thank you so much, Nicholas. There is a question here by the same person. She asked, what was the thought behind assembling various miscellaneous works of various artists to make the Wasteland one influential work? So what was the thought behind putting all these things together? Now that you're reading his biography again, new aspects of his biography are coming up. So what do you think exactly is his idea about, what do you think when he assembled his ideas?
I think it relates to his sense that civilization is in some kind of crisis, so that any poet who wants to write and to produce something that is new doesn't have a tradition that's already existing to draw upon. He doesn't want to write like a 19th century romantic or late Victorian poet, because he feels, as many other artists did at this time, that language is outworn. He feels that in some sense civilization is collapsing, and what in a sense he's doing therefore is a kind of rescue operation. He wants to salvage bits of it, like marvelous lines from Shakespeare, marvelous lines from Spenser, from Marvel, and indeed marvelous phrases and words from the Upanishads and such like. So he's creating, it's almost a kind of, a phrase I've used before, I think, a kind of museum without walls, that Andre Malraux's term. He's gathering these all together, these fragments I have shored against my ruins. So I think there's a conservation urge, but there's also the feeling that these words from the past may have particular relevance to the present.
Thank you. Just moving someone else, Dr. Meenakshi Kulkarni wants to know, does moving away from materialism and knowing yourself provide you peace? In the poem, was the poet suggesting about all the ill effects and barrenness of Western modern world, and if you move towards the East, would you really get Shanti?
I think, it's a very interesting question. I think Eliot does feel that the materialism of modern Western civilization has eroded out certain human qualities. He wrote a famous essay in which he talked about what he called a dissociation of sensibility, which in his view had occurred round about the 17th century with the rise of modern science and technology. And of course, he recognized that had brought enormous benefits in many ways, but he felt that the world was losing touch with the deeper rhythms of life, as you might say. And so he goes back to very ancient remedies, tribal remedies, if you like, fire, purgation, death by water, the old vegetation ceremonies, ancient rites. And he thinks there might be some kind of answer there. And a number of other artists of the time had rather similar feelings. As to the fascinating question of whether he could have found it by going east, in a sense he did resist that. as I mentioned, he was fascinated by Indian philosophy. He felt that in many ways it was superior to Western philosophy, partly because it wasn't hooked onto rational categories, as Western philosophy probably has been ever since René Descartes. And he felt that it offered a wider set of possibilities, but I think at the same time, he didn't in the end feel he wanted to go that far. Some people, for example, some Americans in the later 20th century did go over as fully as they could to various kinds of Eastern philosophy. They became Buddhist monks, for example. Eliot didn't go down that road, perhaps because he felt he wasn't suitable for it, perhaps because he felt disappointed. But it was at one time a strong temptation for him, and he always retained that respect and admiration and theology and thought.
Thank you. There is another question where Fuza wants to know whether the optimal scenes of the Thames, when Eliot is talking about these scenes, does he primarily talk about loss, or is he talking about continuity? Because water, if he's talking about Ganga at the end, professors a continuity from the Himalaya down to the ocean,
yes.
Right? One continuity. And what is exactly Eliot's emphasis here?
I think there is an enormous amount of loss in the poem, but there's also that very strong sense that water, traditionally, whether it's the River Thames or the River Ganges, whether it's the sea, is potentially a source of continuity, of a kind of renewal of meaning and possibility. I think if you, as it were, take a kind of balance sheet, then the Wasteland is weighted towards loss. It's weighted towards a sense of negativity. It's weighted towards a feeling that we have lost something that is irrecoverable. But I think when he turns, for example, to ancient vegetation rites, the kinds of rites, for example, that would involve having some kind of dummy of a person that was then thrown into the water and that would rise again, which was quite crucial to the kinds of rites he was interested in. He would have been asking the question, is something like that possible? Could we still be like that? And it's very difficult because, of course, we come to it with all the sophistication of modern civilization. So we couldn't quite do it in the innocent way that the original practitioners of such rites did. But certainly, I think if one wants to follow that emphasis in the poem, then the symbolism of water as a source of both continuity and renewal is very significant.
Thank you so much. Well, I'm going to club two questions together, Pradeep Khan and Ananya Mishra. So they are concerned about Wasteland today. Well, maybe
Yes.
they're thinking about the pandemic, and what would Eliot say when he finds this connection socially, economically, and politically? It's a desert now. So they think that Wasteland is one such poem which is touted by many critics as having many psychosexual references, as well as biblical references.
Yes.
What is your take on it? So there are how would Eliot react in this pandemic? So this is a modern world where we are suffering, everybody is suffering, and sometimes even when they are praying, they're not allowed to go into the temples, they're not allowed to go into the churches or the mosques. And so what is your take on all these things?
I think that Eliot would have been perhaps particularly distressed by one of the elements that was mentioned, the fact that people cannot gather together or discouraged from gathering together for communal worship, which he saw as very important. And indeed his reason in terms of his living in England for joining the Anglican Church was precisely because it provided that. And I think this was a kind of element that perhaps didn't quite exist as a result of the flu pandemic from 1918 to 1920. At the same time, it's crucial, I think, to stress that Eliot was a poet, and he thought highly of the value of poetry. And I think that what he might have said, a kind of tentative answer, would be that even in this situation that we are in now, people can still read, or they can still hear poetry. It's good to do it communally, but it doesn't have to be done communally. And moreover, what we have now is, of course, the internet through which we're communicating at this very moment, and through which we can access a global range of poetry. In a sense, the internet is Eliot's poem. It's the Wasteland writ large on a global scale. So I think that he would have been very interested in that. He would have been very interested in the way that it is possible to create across the globe, from people who are not physically near each other, virtual communities of interest, as in a sense we are here. We're all interested in this poem, The Wasteland. We're interested in its implications and possibilities, and indeed how it might help us individually and collectively. So I think he would have found it a very interesting time, I think, to be alive in. But he would have recognized, of course, that it was an enormous crisis, just as the First World War and its aftermath and the global flu pandemic of 1918 to 1920 was an enormous crisis, coupled with the breakup of traditional belief systems. It's perhaps just worth suggesting there is maybe a possibility that we've become a bit more used to the breakup of traditional belief systems, the idea that they are in some way under threat or rather fragile, though still enormously powerful and attractive in many ways. But we possibly learn to live with uncertainty a bit more than people could in 1920, when you have essentially a civilization that, as far as Europe is concerned, a civilization that had lasted for 400, 500 years, suddenly cracking up.
Thank you so much. There is a question here. I think we'll take one or two more questions.
Yeah, sure.
I believe you're tired by now. So,
okay, it's very stimulating.
Does the poem talk about female oppression and masculine power?
Does the poem talk about female oppression and masculine power? Yes, I think it certainly does. And indeed, as I was suggesting in the talk, there are many examples of the exploitation of women, particularly the sexual exploitation of women. The story of Philomel, derived from ancient myth, is a classic story, both of rape in itself, but also of the silencing of the victim in the way. It's a very harsh story, but in the way in which Philomel has her tongue cut out to stop her witnessing who her attacker is, though she does actually, in the story, if you know the rest of it or if you look it up, she does actually finally find a way. But yes, there's a great concern, I think, with that in the poem. And it's worth saying a great many of the voices in the poem are women's voices, in fact. They're often voices of women who have been abused or oppressed. So you perhaps don't get what you might like to have, in a sense, portraits of really strong women. But nonetheless, it isn't a poem in which the men come off very well. And it's also the case that Eliot doesn't simply say, this is the fault of individual men. He is analysing a particular social structure that makes it possible. It's a social structure that in the ancient world made the group of Philomel possible. As it's a social structure that in the 1920s, it enables the clerk to take advantage of the typist without any consideration for her feelings in the matter. And it's an area, it has struck me much more in recent years, reading The Wasteland, how much in fact it does focus on the exploitation in various ways, particularly I think in sexual terms of women.
Thank you very much. This is the last question by Baramadevan. I'm sorry we cannot take any more questions because Professor Tredell is tired and it's all. And so Shiva asks you that, sir, in your point of view, quintessentially, what are the factors that contribute to the growing popularity of The Wasteland throughout the years? Why is it popular today?
Yes, why has it been a popular poem, and why is it still a popular poem? Well, I think one reason, the basic reason perhaps, is its poetic quality. That you do have both Eliot's own lines, which are extremely vivid in so many ways, but he is also very good at borrowing lines from the past. Those are pearls that were his eyes, for example, that are also extremely vivid, so he assembles them together. And it's also the case that if you look at The Wasteland, if you think of some of the sections we've read, there are some sections that are in perfectly coherent sentences running on over the poetic lines, but you also get all those other elements of nursery rhyme, for example, London Bridge is falling down, falling down, falling down, elements of a popular song of the time, oh, the moon shone bright on Mrs. Porter and on her daughter, they washed their feet in soda water. There are elements drawn from jazz. Oh, that Shakespearean rag, it's so elegant, so intelligent. In other words, it's using all these resources of poetry. Although Eliot is very erudite, he's also very fond of popular music, he's very fond of popular song, he's aware of nursery rhymes. So he's drawing on the most primal elements of poetry, the kinds of elements that we learn from the cradle upwards before we can talk when we sing, or our mother sings to us, or whatever. So I think there are those elements. The other point, of course, is in terms of its themes, is it does deal with profound issues. There's if you like, the sociological or historical issues, but it also deals with fundamental issues about life, death, the purpose of life, meaning, what happens when we are feeling despairing and how might we go on. Questions like that are also very significant in the poem. And then, of course, it does deal with sociology and history as well. He is painting a particular society at a particular moment. And I think one could argue that what he's painting in the poem, evoking the poem, is the start of the world we have today. It's the world of modernity. That all of the issues that are being raised at that point, though the world has changed in a lot of ways, in the poem are still with us. So in a sense, I think it wins on all levels. It's a poem I've known since in my early teens, and it's always stayed with me. The vivid lines, many of which I can remember by heart. And it's a poem, which is perhaps another point, it's a poem that can also stay with you through life and provide interest, entertainment, concern, and perhaps solace in different situations and as one gets older. And I think Eliot, if his ghost can hear me, would be pleased with this, because this was the kind of poem I think he aspired to write. He found it in Shakespeare, not in one particular play, but in the whole of Shakespeare's plays, and in Dante and in other poets of the past that he admired. But unlike them, he had to kind of make it from scratch. He had to put lots of bits together. He didn't have a ready-made form waiting for him. Going back to the question of why he used all those bits and pieces from other writers. But it probably is, although it can be criticised in a lot of ways, it probably is an inexhaustible poem, one of those classic works. And that's what makes a classic work, of course, that you can read it again and again in different situations, in different parts of the world, and still gain something from it.
Thank you so much. Thank you. It was an illuminating scholarly lecture, and Thank you for your patience in answering each and every question. I'm
Thank you very
really,
much.
we are overwhelmed. You spoke to more than 100 participants from all over India. Thank
Great.
you very much, Professor Tredell.
A
And
great pleasure.
I would now request our scholar Deepshikha Rautrai to give a formal vote of thanks. I
Thank you.
see you so tired. You've been speaking non-stop. Thank you so much.
Great pleasure. Thank you very much indeed.
Good evening, everyone. I am Deepshikha Rautrai. I, on behalf of PG Department of English, Berhampur University, would like to express our sincere gratitude to you, sir, for your amazing lecture. I mean, we cannot express how incredibly thought provoking and inspiring was your lecture. I mean, thank you so much that you made it certain that all those who are listening to you will have an enriching experience. You made our day. Thank you so much, sir. And
Thank you very much indeed.
we fall short of the right adjectives to describe how much we have enjoyed your lecture. Our sincere thank to you. We are really thankful to you. It was really amazing, sir. You kept us glued to, I mean, all the audience. I think the chat box is flowing with gratitude and all. And all of them were virtually glued to you. They were hanging on to each word that you were saying, sir. Thank you so much. Had it not been the shortage of time, and we would have loved to hear you more and more. Thank you so much.
Thank you very much indeed. It's been a great pleasure. And thank you for listening to it. And thank you for all the stimulating questions that I'll be thinking about for a long time to come.
Thank you so much, Nicholas. Thank you for spending so much time with us.
A great
Thank
pleasure,
you for
Shruti.
your benevolence.
Yeah.